And the Churches of Christ in that area got to have I guess a revival or whatever you want to call it. And Lipscomb had buses that they took a lot of the students up to downtown.
Wow.
That to me was being from a little hometown congregation.
Yes.
And seeing that was amazing to me. And I remember writing my grandmother, and she wrote back about how that must have been very impressive.
Yeah, that was, you had what, thousands?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
When I lived up north, we used to go to every year to a Christian camp called Ganderbrook. I don't know if everybody's ever heard of it. It's up in Maine.
Okay.
And it's unique because you get like 200 women from all over the East Coast coming together. And it's just, when we sing and we praise God together, it's just unique experience.
I was just going to say that she said that when I was going to college to Lipscomb, the chapel sessions, the singing was just out of this world. And to be able to hear that many young voices in tune and whatever else is
Yes.
fantastic.
Becky?
This is unique, but being able to worship online through COVID was something very special to me because we were so locked up, but to know that my brothers and sisters were there online with me.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
When my aunt was sick, she couldn't go to church, so we went to check my aunt and uncle's house.
So at your aunt and uncle's house. That's cool. Yes.
One more was Black Mountain. Did you ever go to Black Mountain to yearly?
The yearly, I have once. Yeah.
That was amazing. It was
Blue Ridge Encampment. How many people went to Blue Ridge Encampment? Yeah. Matthew, where's the most interesting place that you and a large group of other men sang? That's not open on Sundays.
To hear the men at WLI sing was very moving because we would have lunch or dinner provided for us and we would have to sing for our meals.
Literally sing for your meal. Okay.
So what they would do is they would bring out the servers and have them line up in front of us and we would circle them and we would have one person lead a song. And Glenn has showed an excerpt of one of those meals and Ethan can attest to it. I mean, to hear the men, just men, sing like that was really awesome. And on Sunday, they had a very unique service where they focused strictly on the Lord's Supper. And it took, what, Ethan, an hour and a half? And they went through in great detail each aspect of it, and each man was able to examine themselves and do all that kind of stuff. So it was really unique.
That's cool. Anybody else? Most unique, enjoyable, exciting, moving setting you've had for worship? Free.
I have two. We went to.
You only do one. I'm just kidding.
We went to the Yosemite encampment for a long time growing up, so that was always unique. And then probably the most meaningful was before going on a bike ride, the dunes in Oregon. Dad would always lead communion and singing, and it was just us and extended family, and then we'd go ride.
That's really up.
I had the privilege in Albany, New York, many years ago, to attend a Billy Graham crusade. And to be there in person and experience that with thousands of other people was really very moving.
Good. Ethan brought up a good point. He asked, he says, are you talking about corporate worship? And I said, that's not what it says. We're going to get to that because it's a good question. And I will say, what we're talking about as a class, we're focusing on public assembly public worship. Brett?
Worship Leader Institute was always really uplifting for me, a lot of different contexts in which we would sing together. One of the neat things that we did one time was a flash mob at Chick-fil-A with about, probably, I don't know, Matt, 40.
We were the Chick-fil-A.
Yes.
No, it was packed, and we probably were about half of the people that were there. There were probably about 40 of us that did that. That was good. And then there was another time when Suzanne and I were in New York City and went to worship with at the Brooklyn Tabernacle, and hear the Brooklyn
Really?
Tabernacle Choir singing live. But the thing that surprised me that I didn't anticipate was that because of the CDs and all that they do, you think of the Brooklyn Tabernacle Choir, but what it was a congregation of about 3,000 people that were singing with. They weren't listening. We weren't listening to the Brooklyn Tabernacle Choir. We were participating in worship with them. That was really
That's cool.
really cool.
We had church one time in the bar on a cruise ship.
Yeah.
That's it, it's such a Sunday morning.
Yes. Having worship when you travel is probably where people experience some things that are incredibly unique. Because you're thrust into situations where you either don't know where you are, there's not a church, and sometimes you think about it, sometimes you plan about it, but sometimes it's how are we going to deal with this? How are we going to handle it? And heard some very good stuff. Yes?
Growing up, when we would travel, there wasn't that many places, stuff like you were saying as far as congregations, but also, there were no fast food places or anything like that. But my mom always packed songbooks and communion. A lot of times we would just have services in the car as we traveled,
Yeah.
but that's different too, so.
It is different, and but those are the memories you hang on to. You probably can tell more about that than the places you went. And that's what happens with us, is we think about things we did. Sometimes it's where you went, but it's things that you did. Anybody else? I want to leave anybody out? All right. So the question, public worship in home or building. That's where we're looking at and talking today. So where do we worship? If you'll open your Bibles to John chapter 4, verse 23. John 4:23, or your smart device. Of course, it depends on if your phone's acting up. Sometimes you don't think it's very smart. Would somebody read John 4:23?
But the hour is coming, and is now here, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such people to worship Him.
What does that mean? What this is a good translation of the Greek, but what's it talking about?
The next verse said God is spirit, so worshiping, they worship in spirit and truth. So,
We worship in spirit and truth just between 10:30 and noon, right? That's it. Oh. Brad said sometimes we go a little longer. Yeah. Well, it is true that we do that time. But where and when do we worship? Yes.
It can really be anywhere.
Yes, because this verse doesn't clarify
It
where.
can be anywhere, as long as you're in that moment with God and you're, it can be anywhere.
It can be anywhere. Can it be any time? Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't clarify where, but I think that's the point, is that the question is asked, where should we worship? In Jerusalem, or not, basically. And when Jesus responds in spirit and in truth, he's saying, there's not a place. There's not a clarification, but that's the point, is that it can be.
How do you think the Jews handled that answer?
Well, they worship
Falcon would have trouble answering because they only had places to go.
They had places to go. They did some at home.
Tells you God, I mean, Jesus told them the time was going to come.
One of the things Jesus does throughout the four Gospels is Christ makes things that we do beyond the act. He makes them personal. He makes them about the way you think, the way you believe, the way you treat others. It's more than just, here's a rule outlined. You can go into the scrolls in the synagogue and you can find it and break it down, but you can also go take a look at what some of the rabbis have said in the Talmud and the Mishnah, and you can read through those and see what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to do it. Jesus comes along and goes, okay, hold on. Yes, there are things to do, but there's also how you do it.
Not just what he's going to bring to us is, I'm here to save you, but how.
How?
By how you mean the heart.
Yes, ultimately the heart. The heart, because, but he brings it to everything. He brings it to worship. He brings it to sin. When he brings it to sin and says, it's more than just doing it. It's the act of thinking it. I would imagine a lot of people that were in the Jewish leadership were kind of like, so what I've been thinking and feeling that I'm not doing is going to weigh against me?
If you go back to verse 23, it talks about true worshipers.
Yes.
That make a bit more to that.
Yet a time is coming, and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in the Spirit.
But the discussion had been between Samaritans and Jews, and he doesn't clarify that it's the Jews will worship, but the Samaritans will worship.
Worshipers.
True,
Because he understands the change that's coming. There's worshipers. When he dies, everything changes. When he's resurrected, everything changes. It's like, well, isn't it the same? No. There's time in between that. But the first had to happen for the second to happen. And the second had to happen for us to be here.
Jeremy?
Yo.
I think when I hear that, where do we worship, or when do we worship, still goes back to every day, every hour, how we live our life is truly worshiping God. And so often we fall into the trap, if you will, of a time and a place and think, okay, check that block. But in fact, you may check that block from a time and a place, but truly, you're not worshiping.
Sure. Fred, where do you live? Not your address, but location on a map for North Carolina.
Up on a mountain just south of the park.
Close to what national park?
There's a national forest.
That's it. Sorry. If any of you have never been to Fred's house, I'm not saying go like after service. So let me clarify that. Check with Fred. But Fred lives in a very beautiful canopy of trees. It's not a tree house, but when you're on the deck, it very much looks like that. And when lightning hits one of those trees, it will make you go inside very quickly. The mountain that we live near, how many of you have gone driving to look at leaves? I know you can just look out your window and see them, and we live here. How many of you have looked at a sunset at the beach? Or you've been on top of a mountain and you've looked out and have thought, look how God has painted. Is that worship? Yeah. Private worship, corporate worship, two different things. Well, let's get into the corporate stuff. Ecclesia, for those of you that want to look that up, it's Strong's Word 1577. Ecclesia is church. Paul uses, this word is used among the Greeks of a body of citizens gathered to discuss. Paul uses it most often to designate new communities he established. And what did Paul go around establishing? Churches. The term ecclesia derives from the Old Testament, where the people of Israel were the Kahal Yahweh or Bahal Israel. They were both translated into the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, to mean ecclesia. Numbers 16, 1 through 3. If you'll open your Bibles, this is a very interesting place where we see gathering. And I'm really going to ask you, after we read this, how many of you would think worship is involved, or is this just a gathering of people, or both? You've heard this story, I hope. Somebody read verses 1 through 3. It's okay if you don't want to take on the words, I'll do it. Korah, son of Izhar, the son of Kohath, son of Levi, and certain Reubenites. Dathan, Abiram, the sons of Eliab, and On, the son of Peleth, became insolent. You know the story. They rose up against Moses. With them were 250 Israelite men, well-known community leaders who had been appointed members of the church. They came as a group, opposed to Moses and Aaron, and said to them, "You've gone too far. The whole community is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is with them. Why then do you set yourselves above the Lord's assembly?" That's the Hebrew side of that.
Jeremy, was the word, you said church, was that council, or was that the same word as earlier in the verse?
No, actually it's not. The community that gathers, let me make sure it's
At the end of verse 2, is that the same word? You said church, I didn't know that you meant.
Council.
I'm looking it up. No, it's not the same word. Lord's assembly. Yahweh. Bahal is Yida for the community. Ida and Bahal for assembly. Oh, yeah. It's a different word that's used. But what we get here and what's shown there, this word is used. Jesus will go on, and Matthew 16, verse 18. If somebody would read that one. Matthew 16, 18.
$16.18.
16:18.
And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it.
There are multiple other places where the word ecclesia is used, talking about a gathering of people, where they gathered, what they did. And Kylie, I'm glad you asked that question about the Old Testament reference. Is the word used the same way? There's a group that gathers, it's one word. There's a group that they're referencing that God is over. Fred.
If I may,
Yes.
in Acts chapter 19,
Mm-hmm.
when Paul was in Ephesus and there was that riot,
Ooh, yes.
the word ecclesia is actually used 2 or 3 different times in that context. One of the references is to this mob, and it talks about this mob being in confusion, this assembly being in confusion, and the word ecclesia is used there.
It is. It's not always used as a reference that is holy and is spiritual. It is reference a group of people who get. It's a meeting of people
Usually for
for a particular purpose. Yes.
And the same thing is in that same chapter where the fella gets up and says, "Hey, God will flesh this out in the end. The Romans don't like it if we
if we gather like this. Yeah.
We get this mob here, this ecclesia here, and we're gonna have to answer to it, to the Romans. So let's take care of this in the regular assembly. You know, and that's again the same word. So I think, you know, we have definitely, we definitely see in the New Testament a specific use of the word ecclesia, church, in the way that we're describing here.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way that there's a very special meaning to the word baptism or immersion. You know, it is a general, you know, the baptizo is a general Greek word that means to immerse,
Mm-hmm.
but it takes on a very special meaning in the context of the way that it's used. And it's the same thing with our churching.
Thank you. Ethan, did you ever end up? Okay, you're just rubbing your head. That's fine. I saw a hand go up, and I wasn't sure. No, it's fine. Feel free to scratch your scalp at any time.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm here all week. We have other phrases, other Greek words that are used, Evangelius and Plethos in the New Testament, and they're different ways that are used, talking about gatherings, assemblies, and it's more of a what, not a where, because all these references are talking about what specifically? The people. We don't have a reference at this point to a place. We have a people.
And ecclesia being called out, that's what it means, something like that.
It means called out the same way automobile
Yeah.
means, you know, something that can move itself. It means that, but that's not how the word's used. Automobile means car. Ecclesia means legal gathering. You know, it is like a city council. That's how they use the word.
But
So
were they
it-
not called out to do that?
Well, ek means out. Kaleo means to call. So, but it's the way they use the word, there's no calling going on. It's a gathering. So we used to make a big deal out of the etymology of that word. It's the same sort of thing, like hot dog doesn't actually refer to a warm canine. That's a food. Ecclesia doesn't have a reference to a crier. It probably originally did.
That's what I thought.
You know, like
Somehow we got that.
when it first started, it would be somebody going around going, oh yeah, come to the square, you know, and eventually the gathering got named after how it got pulled together, but by the time we have it in Greek in the first century, it's being used simply to mean the gathering of the people, and it usually is a reference to like a legal body, like the Senate would be the ecclesia. You know, a legal gathering that gets together to make decisions about how they're going to function, how they're going to live life together, how you're going to organize the polis, the city, politics. So the ecclesia that is church is going to be God's legal gathering that gets together under its king to say, okay, how are we going to do this? How are we going to live life together? One of the things it does is worship, but ecclesia doesn't mean worship. Ecclesia would also refer to any time we get together to do literally anything. We're going to serve a group of people, that's ecclesia. We're going to serve each other, we're going to have a funeral together and honor the dead, we're going to have a fellowship, we're going to do a camp out. All of that's church.
It's all church. Yeah.
All of it.
And that's a sharp contrast to what the Jews were instructed to do. They had the physical temple.
Yes.
They were told how to build that temple, even when it was, you know, on the move. So that's, like you were saying, there's a sharp contrast with what Jesus is.
Jesus' ministry comes and makes big changes.
Do you think that church would be more related to being, in that sense, instead of being contrasted to the temple, it's more contrasted to being God's people? Like, you know, the Jews were constantly called God's chosen people. Would being the church, the assembly of, you know, as Ethan was saying, you know, of God's people, whatever they're doing, God, the Jews were, in the Old Testament, were supposed to be God's people wherever they were, whatever they were doing.
Yes. And that doesn't change. That intent of it is your life, This is what you're going to do when you gather to get to study and to learn. It's who you're going to be on the Sabbath as you do nothing and you do rest and rest of the day. As we talked about 2 weeks ago, for that time, the days of the week are named after the Sabbath. First day after the Sabbath, second day after the Sabbath, third day, on and on.
But that assembly, like Mom said, was still, God directed them to do it in a place,
Yes.
For specific things in all the Levitical law.
And how'd they do with that? I'll say we because we're all human. Did it go well? Almost about as well as the one single rule. So the how. How did they do it in the first century? Well, we see one of the times is, if you'll turn to Acts chapter 2, verse 6. Acts chapter 2, verse 6. We see a gathering. Somebody could read that for us. We're going to have 3 readings, and they're all going to be in Acts.
When they heard this sound, a crowd came together in the wilderness because each one heard their own language being spoken.
Right? Somebody will read 10, verse 27.
Talking with him, Peter went inside and found a large gathering of people.
That's it. That's it. And Acts 16, 13.
On the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river, where we expected to find a place to prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who gathered there.
So how many gatherings of people do we have, and where? Where was Pentecost held? The temple. I would ask you where the next one was held. That's up there on the screen. And the last one at a river.
Well, it's probably a synagogue.
What do you mean? Talk about that.
Prosuke is a place of prayer, but that is a synonym for synagogue.
Yes.
However, Luke is being judicious. He knows that his text is going to be read by some very conservative folks in Jerusalem who are not going to be cool with the idea that a synagogue can be run by women. So he calls it by its more open name. But yeah, that's probably a synagogue. I've got an article on, let me see it, Irish history. But it's probably not just out sitting beside the river. It's probably a structure, a building. And you're way out in the provinces here, far away, so you're very much in the diaspora of Judaism. And so Lydia is probably the benefactor who comes up with the money.
Who comes up with the money to pay for this.
But Lydia being a businesswoman, that's not happening in Jerusalem or Judea, but it's
happening in lots of other places.
Diaspora.
So we see we've got a lot of places, we've got a lot of options. Yes.
I think it's interesting that in my version of the text, it calls Lydia a worshiper of God.
Why do you think that? Oh, let's see, do we chase that? Go ahead. You got 30 seconds. Go. Oh.
No, I guess we were kind of
Worshiper of God.
at who's doing what, where is it held, and then the next verse, the Lord opened her heart. So I think that's interesting that we're talking about, is it emotions and checkmark church that you do, or is it something that is deeper and personal and heartfelt?
That's a good question.
Calls her a worshiper of God.
Worshiper of God. Yes, Deep.
The word worshiper of God or God-fearer is actually a reference to a class of people that were most open to the gospel. They were Gentiles who had not gone the full way to conversion. So they had accepted Jewish life, but especially the men hadn't taken circumcision on. I'm not sure what the reference means in reference to a woman. because that's not an issue. That's
No, women can be worshipers of God.
Um,
Why doesn't it say worshiper of Christ?
she doesn't know him yet.
That's right. Sorry, I know. It's your question. Apologize. We will see throughout Scripture in Romans, there are several houses that are used. 1 Corinthians, the house of Aquila and Priscilla. Colossians 4, the church gathered in Nymphia's home. Philemon, Paul greets the church that met in the home of Philemon. In 2 John chapters 10 and 11 warn readers against bringing false teachers into their house. Now, growing up, I always heard that, talking about eating together, bringing in your house, and having that kind of conversation. But after reading this, I realize how much that is a reference to where they worship. As I've gone through this, I realize how much I don't know. And I've learned that the more you learn about something, the more you learn that you don't know something. But one of the things that is constantly repeated in my reading and research is how much the movement of Christianity, the gathering of Christians, is about the phrase we'll read several times about being set apart. Well, the way to be set apart is you have to be different than the people around you. And there was two other groups that worshipped. One, there's a whole bunch of lumped into one, but one is Jews. Jewish meeting met on Saturday, rested on Sabbath, that would meet and have worship at synagogue. The other were pagans, and they had their pagan temples, and they had the way they did things. Well, Christianity comes along and is like, okay, we have to set ourselves apart because you've got Jewish people coming and you've got Gentiles coming. So people who they see coming in and out are automatically going to make the assumption of, well, that must be a synagogue, but why are they meeting a day after Sabbath? This must be something different. And then there's a discussion there. Then they see Gentiles going in and thinking through this whole process like, okay, they've got Gentiles going in. They don't worship together. What is this? So being separate, being different, being apart, it was a tool to be used, but also it had a lot to do with keeping them safe, keeping them healthy. It was not uncommon. For many years, Christians were persecuted. We can read many stories about that. But it's about being set apart and being different. I did want to read this. So, all of this doesn't talk about where we're sitting right now. I want to read you some information. A very learned man, Ethan and I have talked about him recently. His name's Dr. Everett Ferguson. How many of you have either read a book by him or heard him speak? Or maybe even know who he is? Okay. I had the privilege of hearing him speak once, and as I told Ethan, the man's brain is huge. He died several years ago, but it was amazing. Sorry. Okay, I will check my reference and I will make sure that's true. He was in his... Yeah. Don't tell Ethan. Okay, New Testament speaks of a large church in Jerusalem, but they met together in a public place. In many cases, when we have Acts 2, verse 46, it was in the outer courts of the temple. They had a place. And by the way, the temple and the meeting in the outer courts was very common. We see Jesus go there. He has meetings. He heals people there. He turns over tables and drives out money changers there. Now, the Emperor Constantine recognized Christianity legal in 313. So corporate ownership of buildings by the church was legally ambiguous at that point. We don't have records. The first record that we have, and Kylie does not like this place, is the Roman catacombs. Little claustrophobic down there with all the people, or what's left of it. But the singing in the catacombs is pretty cool, though. I just want to say. Now, what we know, and as of right now, what history has taught us, around 240, there was a house that came into Christian possession and was remodeled. In 256, we see a house that was used that was short-lived. The house at Dura, that's the one that was remodeled. They essentially took a house and just fine-tuned and made adjustments so that it would fit their needs. And then he asked this question: why do Christians remodel or build separate structures for worship instead of continuing to use private homes or public spaces? Why do y'all think that? Space. Once Constantine said, hey, this is legal, go, what do you think happened? It started to grow. Unfortunately, when is what date is where so many people, or right around what date is when the church has had the largest attendance in, I don't know, 50 years? An event happened in our country. The war sent a lot of people in, but 9/11. People talked about the huge number of people that were in churches. When you have something, there's an influx, there's a growth. That's one of the things that we take a look at. Here we go. They came together for what reasons? I'm going quick because we're almost out of time. Strength, encouragement, and other acts of worship that we will discuss. Let's talk about that encouragement. How encouraged are you by any form of worship? How does it encourage you? Or not? How many of you have been someplace and you felt very strong?
I think it's hard to put into words.
What do you mean? I'm going to actually explain what not having words means. You're welcome.
The strength of encouragement is so much of the spirit and the peace. And you can't explain it to somebody else who's never experienced it.
Yes.
Just the encouragement can come from God and the Spirit, but it also should come from each other, from being together. I mean, that's why they came together, to encourage each other and all of you.
Yeah, good. We even have verses, do not neglect the assembly. And as I read Dr. Ferguson's take on that, and I'm in no way saying that that's what the scripture actually says, but he says that he thinks that has to do with the people, that the sin is to the people. Because when you're not there, your contribution isn't there. And I thought it was very interesting. But when you look at all of this and worship about gathering, it's about how we connect. And since worship is also about life, and you think about, am I doing something that is worshipful? That's a very telling question that goes through your mind. Is what I'm doing worshipful? Is what a lot of ways we would say is this honoring Christ? But the way of worship is like, there is an honor to it, but is it they're giving glory, giving praise?
What did you say he said about that?
About the don't neglect the giving meeting of the saints. Dr. Ferguson says that it has more to do with people gathering together and the influence that we have on one another. That not meeting is actually against the people that you meet with or don't meet with in that case. It's just an interesting take. Yes.
I apologize to those that are not sports fans, but a sports analogy, if I may. You can have a group of 10 young men practice basketball individually. Just shoot free throws, practice with dribbling, practice shooting, and you can have all of this going on, and they can, each of them individually become very, very talented in what they do in playing basketball. But no, not really. They aren't getting good at playing basketball. They're getting good at shooting baskets and shooting free throws and dribbling. Until you have the team come together and work together, you don't really tap into the skills that they are individually developing. When we worship God alone, we become more attuned to Him. We do open our hearts to have God speak to us and move us in certain ways. And there's no question that it develops us. And God wishes that for us. But until we come together as a team, we don't even approach the potential for good that God wishes for us as a congregation and as His family.
Very well said. I hate to do this, but we got to go. On the screen is next week's lesson. It's a play on words. Hope you enjoy it. Yes. Sorry, hold on. Question? Okay, sorry. My mistake. Ethan, no need to mourn. It was his wife who passed, not Dr. Ferguson. All right. Have a good week. We will see what happens next week.
Jeremy, at some point in time, all of us in life, we're all liars, and we just don't.
Yes, but can you worship with one?